Dear students, welcome to UGC EPG Patashala on Human Rights and Duties. My name is Professor YSR Murthy. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights Studies, OP Jindal Global University. In the paper on Philosophical Foundations of Human Rights and Sources of Human Rights, today we will take up the historical development of human rights. Before we move further, I want to briefly recall what we covered in the last module. We traced the developments from ancient times till the year 1215. In fact, as I said, the human rights as we understand today did not spring from nowhere. They evolved over a period of centuries. There were injustices, oppression, subjugation, colonialism, discrimination, and in response to that, there had been certain events, all of which shaped the evolution of human rights. In particular, we saw the notions of human rights in the Vedic literature. We also saw notions like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina. Now, let's turn our attention to the next development or next milestone in the evolution, that is the Code of Hammurabi, which was adopted in the year 1795 before Christ to 1750. Now, that code talked about equality and certain other principles. Now, then there was a Cyrus Cylinder, which talked about freedom of food and movement, freedom of religion, freedom from oppression. And then we also discussed the rock edicts of Ashoka, which talked about humane treatment to prisoners of war, equality before law, freedom of religion. And then in this evolution, we saw the Magna Carta, which was adopted in the year 1215, which was signed by the then King of Britain. And we also saw its significance, how it upheld the rule of law, it talked about taxation, talked about equality, it talked about a few other notions of human rights, that there cannot be a punishment without trial, and how the fines that are imposed must be proportional to the crime committed. Now, this module we will take up the developments from the period 1215 to 1689. At the end of this module, students will be in a position to understand various political, religious, and cultural developments during 1215 and 1689 in Europe. You will also understand the significance of each of these developments and their impact on the evolution of human rights. First, let us take up Renaissance movement. What does Renaissance mean? It literally means rebirth. It signifies the reawakening, revival of Greek and Roman culture in the 14th and 15th centuries. These gave a great impetus to the study of classical literature in Europe. There was a period of discoveries of the world and of men, literature, painting, sculpture, architecture, flourished. There were discoveries by Copernicus, Galileo, Ptolemy, which challenged or changed the established customs and religious beliefs. It contributed to humanism, religious tolerance, and material prosperity. And there was a Reformation movement against abuse of authority, the taxes imposed by Pope, corruption in the church, and they were against several doctrines and practices of Roman Catholic Church. Martin Luther led this Protestant reform movement in Germany, and there was a tremendous resentment against the practices of indulgence. It's a kind of a cash payment towards remission for past sins. The Protestant reform movement also sowed the seeds of modern democracy. These revolutionary ideals moved from religion to politics. John Calvin led the Reformation movement in England. He asserted that congregation, not the civil power, is the basis of his church. Calvinism highlighted austerity, distrust of all ceremony and color. The Roman Catholic Church evolved measures to fight the new doctrine with the Council of Trent. The popes followed a counter-reformation policy. The Dutch Declaration of Independence in 1591 was another milestone. The Spanish King Philip II caused the revolt. In fact, the Dutch people who were under a colonial rule rebelled against the oppression of the rule by Spain and asserted their rights. The king deprived them of their rights and privileges. For religious uniformity, he tried to revive Catholicism, which was resented by the Dutch people. The Act of Abjuration or Dutch Declaration of Independence was signed on July 26, 1581. It was a result of the United Provinces. There was an expression of criticism against the Spanish rule and the breach of social contract between the people on the one hand and the government. William of Orange led the War of Independence. What is the significance of the Dutch Declaration of Independence in the evolution of human rights, which was quoted, unquote, titled as the rights of man? The rights of man have been discussed in detail. It led to the establishment of Dutch Republic. This War of Independence inspired the Puritan Revolution, American War of Independence, and the French Revolution. It also inspired the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights, 1689. Now, let us come to what is this Glorious Revolution. The then Britain rule was regarded as the popular despotism, and in fact, the policies of Stuart kings in Britain led to constitutional conflict. This revolution refers to the Civil War during 1642 to 1649 and the bloodless revolution of 1688. And in fact, in 1647, there was an agreement. English politician, activist, Levelers produced it. He called for liberty of conscience in the matter of religion, freedom from conscription. He called for equality and non-discrimination. Now, the tyrannical rule of King James II also led to further ferment. There was a religious and political factors responsible. The Protestant Christians became uncomfortable with the patronage of the state given to Catholicism, and there was dissatisfaction of the masses in the rule of King James II. The Glorious Revolution in Britain was a result of an attempt by a group of English lords to overthrow the King James II from the throne. The objective behind the revolution was to establish the supremacy of the Parliament over the monarchy. And the purpose of the revolution was realized when the new monarchs accepted the Declaration of Rights along with the throne. Now let us turn our attention to Petition of Rights, 1628. The English Parliament prepared and sent it to King Charles I. It was initiated by Sir Edward Coke. And what are the principles? 1. No taxes may be levied without consent of Parliament. 2. No subject may be imprisoned without show cause. 3. No soldiers may be quartered upon by the citizenry. 4. Martial law may not be used in times of peace. The objective behind this revolution was to establish the supremacy of the Parliament. It was realized with the acceptance of Declaration of Rights by new monarchs. What is the significance of this development? The English Bill of Rights was signed into law in the year 1689, and it established the rule of constitutional monarchy in England. It guaranteed individual rights to its citizens. While it was called the Bill of Rights, the primary focus of this document was to define the relationship between the Parliament on the one hand and the monarchy on the other, rather than elaborate on the issue of what individual rights are. It became a source of inspiration for the spread of parliamentary form of democracy throughout the world. Now, in summary, the Renaissance left a rich legacy and contributed to the growth of individualism in Europe. It challenged traditional customs and religious traditions. The political, economic, and social religious causes resulted in reduction of papal authority. The Dutch Declaration of Independence 1581 has a great significance in the evolution of human rights. It questioned the right of one country to curb the rights and liberties of another set of people. There was a movement towards absolute monarchy was reversed in favor of parliamentary form of government. The Westminster model in Britain became a model for many other countries, including India. The glorious movement also brought significant reforms with regard to dependence of monarchy on Parliament in matters of appointment, suspension of laws, the consent of Parliament with regards to passing and suspension of law, trial by jury, right to petition, and freedom from excessive fines, punishments of persons accused or convicted of crimes. If you look at the Indian practice today, no taxes can be levied without approval of the Parliament, and not a single rupee can be spent without authorization from Parliament. The union budget is presented before the Parliament. The demands for grants of different ministries and departments are placed before the Parliament, and the opposition members, the ruling party members discuss the various financial matters, and it's approved. And if there is a objection by the opposition members, they move a cut motion stating that the amount that is allocated to a particular budget head be reduced, and then these motions, cut motions, financial bills, budget, demands for grants, supplementary demands for grants are placed before the Parliament for its approval, and thereafter only the monies can be spent by the executive in the manner as approved by the Parliament for the purposes that has been sanctioned. And what is the origin of this practice? One can trace it back to the medieval times, where you see the Dutch Declaration of Independence. Dutch were under the colonial rule of Spain, there were restrictions on the nobles, and the traditional rights enjoyed by the nobles and the cities were curtailed. The colonial master, that is the Spain, imposed heavy taxes, restricted the traders and merchants, appointed their own favorites in key positions of power. All these factors contributed to the oppressing of the people, and also the Dutch Declaration of Independence. One of the critical elements there was excessive taxation. In the same vein, you look at the developments in Britain. There again, you see the king. Earlier on, there was a doctrine of divine right to rule. In other words, the king had a divine right to rule. The king could do no wrong. The king is sovereign and he is supreme, and there is no authority higher than the king. Now, that notion has given away by the challenge posed by people. For instance, there was all this Renaissance movement where there was a spurt of, or there was a growth of flourishing of culture, architecture, literature, etc. The printing press was invented, and then the printed publications came around, and all of them gave a strong impetus to the critical questioning, critical inquiry, and there was a growth of traders, trading class and merchants, and they resented the king's power. They resented the imposition of excessive taxes by the king, and when they could not put up any longer, they waged their struggle through the parliament, and that it became a standoff between the parliament on the one hand and the king on the other, as to who is supreme, who is sovereign. And eventually, we saw a Bill of Rights that was adopted in the England context, and it became a law which created a constitutional monarchy and which guaranteed individual rights to its citizens. And the powers of the king were clipped in favor of the parliament. All taxation measures have to be authorized by the House of Commons. So thus, you see the erosion of the authority of the monarch in favor of the House of Commons or the Parliament. And this Westminster model became an example for many countries the world over. In short, as I said, the history of human rights is a struggle, a series of struggles against subjugation, against misuse of authority, against colonialism, against discrimination, against human rights violations. And these struggles contested the religious authority. These struggles contested the king's authority, and there came about a glorious revolution. There came about English Bill of Rights or Dutch Declaration of Independence, And these in turn inspired struggles elsewhere. As we are going to see in the next module, whatever happened in Britain as a part of the bloodless or a glorious revolution, in turn inspired the French War of Independence or French Revolution, and also American War of Independence or American Revolution. So, in conclusion, the human rights as we understand today evolved over many centuries. There were economic, political, social, cultural developments which impacted on the development or evolution of human rights, and today the various rights as we recognize them, the notions of rights can be easily traced back to these historical developments or milestones. In other words, these milestones have a great significance in the human rights. Thank you.